Yo ho ho! Welcome back to another video. Thank you for joining me today. As always, I hope you're keeping well. So as you can tell by the title, I'm going to be talking about the best books that I read over 2024. I read a lot of fantastic books, a lot of new to me authors, a lot of branching out and trying things that wouldn't really be in my comfort zone and turned out to be complete surprises. So without further ado, let's get into the books. The first one that really has stayed with me since I read it was Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. This really kind of blindsided me when I read it because so many people have hyped this book up and they've said like, oh my god, the main character is so unhinged, and it always falls under the like unhinged woman subgenre category that people are so hyped in talking about at the moment. And I feel like based on what happens within the first 60 pages of that book, that's kind of not super accurate, because I feel like a lot of people leave out the fact that we are dealing with childhood essay. I would have liked some heads up knowing how heavy this book is initially before it gets all weird and fun and freaky. That would have been decent, but anyway, now you know. So this story follows our main character Natsuki. When we initially start reading it, she is a young child and she believes that she's some sort of witch or that she has some other worldly powers. And then her fantasy starts to take hold when she meets up with her cousin once a year at the family reunion at their grandparents' lodge. And he believes that he is like an extraterrestrial, so she starts believing the same sort of thing. And it's this really kind of charming childhood experience that they share with each other initially. And then we go into the massive event that happens within her life as a result of this piano teacher taking advantage of her. And the fact that no other adult in her life has her back. The internalized misogyny within the mother's character is really difficult to read. It is so frustrating. At certain times I wanted to throw this book across the room based on that character alone. But it's just sad knowing that this is the situation that is so real and so many people have had to deal with in childhood abuse situations. I found that really bleak and depressing to get through, and I was like, where's all the unhinged fun that this is meant to have? And then we sort of get into it. So the story then jumps forward in time and we find our main character is in her 30s. She's in a marriage of convenience. We're seeing that Natsuki is still dealing with her past, and all this kind of weird stuff that happened to her while growing up has definitely affected her and shaped her as an adult. There's certainly moments that are very endearing and charming within this novel. It's not all doom and gloom, so I know I'm kind of like saying how heavy it is. It's heavy because it deals with heavy themes. The way I felt about this book after I finished it, and how I'll discuss some of the other books that I read, is that when a book really impacts me after I finish it, I feel like it kind of echoes around in my mind for a couple of weeks or a couple of months or however long. And this is still one of the books that I think back to. The story has just really stayed with me, for good and for bad. So yeah, it was definitely an experience, but I loved how easily immersed I was in the story from the very beginning. And obviously I was very sympathetic towards our characters, and the writing was able to just really pull me in. This is definitely worth a read if you're someone who's into weird literary fiction, but just be aware of those heavy themes, as I feel like it may be quite triggering for anyone who's experienced anything similar. Another 4-star book that has really stayed with me and that I really enjoyed, and I feel like it really surprised me because I did not go into it expecting to, 1, binge through it in almost one sitting, and 2, for it to be my now favourite book from this author, but it is Faux by Iain Reid. So I've now read all of Iain Reid's published works, which are only 3 that I'm aware of. And Faux has definitely been my favourite, which is quite surprising because obviously a lot of people gravitate towards I'm Thinking of Ending Things. That was my most recent read. So Faux follows a couple who have escaped their busy city life and are living on the outskirts of a city where they're kind of like in a sort of farming, cozy, casual, slow living sort of life. So they really live a very isolated and kind of boring life. And one evening before they are due to head to bed, the wife is looking out the window and she sees the lights of a car approaching, which is weird because they never get any visitors. They've never had any visitors. And once this stranger knocks on the door, they realize that their life is now forever changed based on the information that this stranger tells them. Naturally, this leaves the couple in shock, but things start to take off from there, where this is like when their relationship starts to fragment and break down a little bit. It's a very like dystopian / sci-fi related tale, and I just loved every minute of it. Like, I could see why some people would think that this plot is a little bit boring, because you are, you know, house sitting with this couple waiting for the day that their lives are going to change. But I found the story to be very sort of introspective and quiet, and I think that's why I enjoyed it so much. Next is a book that I borrowed from the library that I had no expectations of whatsoever. I don't even know what brought me to pick it up. I think I just kind of was interested by the cover of all things, and this book really impressed me. The writing style blew me away, and the kind of humor and dark humor that was in it was something that I really kind of related to, and that book was Ripe by Sarah Rose Etter. So this book follows our main character, who has started a job in what she thinks is going to be her dream job, but it actually turns out to be a nightmare. She's working for a startup in Silicon Valley. She doesn't really realize like how demanding the job is going to be. She has to work incredibly long hours. She works on projects and presentations, and her boss just completely dismisses her work and dismisses the amount of time that goes into it, and tells her regularly to start over again. And this book was able to make me feel like I was there. Like, this book actively stressed me out. But not only is she just feeling like her world is crumbling and that she doesn't really know what to do with herself now, she also has this black hole that follows her wherever it goes. And the black hole has been with her whole life, and it seems to feed on her misery and any sort of negative emotions. So, as you can guess, the black hole is getting significantly bigger the more work that she does and the more times that she is just told no or put down. There are some really humorous, dark moments within this story that I really appreciated. I find that it would probably have been more funny had it not been so on the nose with what working in that type of environment can actually be like. At times when it was just being so over the top with certain characters being so hysterical and all that sort of thing, I was like, but like, people like this exist in the real world. Like, that's what's fucked up about this story, you know? This book definitely leans into the unhinged woman trope that people are really eating up at the moment. But again, be aware that there are some heavier moments, such as dealing with an unplanned pregnancy. I feel like there's a balance to these books. It's like, one is that they throw in completely over the top characters with over the top situations and stuff, but there's always kind of like a underlying heavy theme that has to be dealt with and is dealt with within these kind of stories, you know? So like, people can dismiss them as like, oh, my silly little books, but in reality they are bringing forward, you know, uncomfortable discussions that are being had. And I just really appreciate books like this. Next, I'm going to lump in two books as one. They turned out to be probably two of my most favorite books that I read over 2024, but books that I feel like saved me from going into a reading slump, saved me from going through like a bout of depression and anxiety, because they were so lighthearted and I so thoroughly enjoyed reading them. And those two books were Legends and Lattes and Bookshops and Bonedust by Travis Baldree. So I would regard myself as the type of person who does not enjoy reading happy books, books with happy endings, books that have low risk to them, where you know for a fact that like none of the characters are going to die, you know, no one's in peril, there's no damsel in distress, there's, you know, no horrible undertone. That's my jam for the most part. But even I get burned out on reading so much of that. I feel like I bought them on a little bit of a manic whim, and I really just had to force myself to pick up Legends and Lattes. And once I did that, I was like, oh, I get it. I get why these books are so hyped and so beloved within like the Booktube and BookTok community. And yeah, I cannot wait for the third one to come out. Both these stories follow the same characters for the most part. We're following Viv, who decides to give up being a warrior and wants to open a coffee shop in a small town. And the only problem is that like nobody knows what coffee is. And she has a lot of things set up against her, but she has saved up all her money, and this is really her one shot to try to live a more normal, quieter, happy life. And so Legends and Lattes is just about her setting up her coffee shop. Bookshops and Bonedust, which is a prequel story. So we learn about Viv. She is basically caught up in a small coastal town after she's really badly injured. and there she meets a wonderful character who takes her in, and she starts working part-time at this bookshop, and she's allowed to basically read as many books as she wants to. And the both of them were just so endearing and so comforting, and something that I didn't know I needed until I actually sat down and read them. These were some of the books that made me feel like, okay, I need to like be a little bit more open-minded to certain books, you know, because I also thought that these were going to be quite childish and stuff. They're not. There's plenty of swearing in them, which I enjoyed. It just made me kind of like reflect on myself and my own personal biases and stuff, and, you know, judging a book by its cover basically. So these were probably the two most unexpectedly pleasant reads of the year. The next book was another library borrow, which I really need to get my hands on this author's books. Like, I find that like it's really difficult for me to buy a book that I've already read, even if I absolutely loved it. Like, there's so many books that I have given like 4 or 5 stars to that I don't currently own. So whenever I go through and want to talk about them, I'm like, I don't even have a physical copy of them. Like, I need to crack on with this. But anyway, rant aside, the next book I want to talk to you about is The Water Shall Refuse Them by Lucie Mcknight Hardy. Now, this was a really subtle, slow build into a horror novel. It's a folk horror novel, and it follows our main character, Nif, who's a 16-year-old girl, and it's set in the 1970s during a heat wave, and her family has moved to a small town in Wales as a result of their youngest daughter passing away in a drowning incident. So the whole family is grieving, and they have decided to pick up sticks and, you know, try to leave the memory of that horror behind them and start afresh. But naturally, it's not that easy. The parents are still really going through the motions. The mother is incredibly detached from the family, and it kind of becomes Nif's responsibility to be the mother figure for the time being. But she's also a teenage girl, and she also likes being a little bit of a misfit, and she goes out and she collects kind of rocks and sticks, and she's very into the occult, and she has her own version of witchcraft. She has a little shrine at home that she keeps building towards, and she meets a local neighbor boy who is also into kind of the weird occultness, and he ends up giving her a skull that he found in the woods, and the two of them just kind of set out and get to know one another. And for a while, as you're reading it, you're like, okay, when's something scary going to happen? When's the horror going to set in? And it is just such a subtle, slow burn, and it delivers such a powerful ending that my jaw was just on the floor, like, once again, because that's how I felt when I read Lucie Mcknight Hardy's short stories, that like I literally, after each one, I'd have to pick my jaw up off the floor because I couldn't see the ending that she was ultimately getting to. So I feel like she's just one of those authors whose writing style is kind of naturally like slow, and she's subtle and likes to build you up to a massive bang right at the end. I definitely feel this was more literary horror for sure. If you go into this thinking that it's going to be a straight up horror novel, you're going to be disappointed. You're going to be one of those people on Goodreads being like, there was nothing scary about this book. Nothing scary ever happened. It is kind of like the small things that count, and the small things that you have to kind of pay attention to within this story in order to start feeling that unease and feeling the distrust and knowing that something is happening beyond our control. And yeah, that's what I ultimately really enjoyed about this book. Next, I have 2 books that I want to talk about by an author that has become one of my now auto-buy authors, one of my new all-time favourite authors, and that is Otessa Moshfegh. So I read Eillen. Oh wait, I read Lapvona, and I also read Eillen. 2 completely different novels from one another, but both of them made such an impression on me. Both of them just blew me away. Eillen is definitely more of a subtle read, and Lapvona is more in your face with outrageous, unrealistic, over-the-top characters and a lot of kind of awful things happening to our main character despite him being an awful character himself. This is definitely a book for people who love unreliable narrators and love just reading about terrible characters, where Eillen is definitely more laid back, it's more chill, but it also leads into quite an over-the-top ending.
and it leads you there quite slowly. It was definitely a book that I took my time with, whereas Lapvona, I basically binge read it again over like a day or two because I couldn't stop thinking about it anytime I wasn't reading it. With Eillen, there was more time to really take in the story and understand the characters, know why they're behaving in the way that they are. I'll talk about Eillen first. So this follows a young woman who's working at a correction center for young boys, and she's very bored with her life. She's kind of sort of the caregiver for her father. Her father used to be a policeman and he's still very well respected, but he's an awful drunk, and she just has to deal with him being super volatile towards her. So if anything, work is her escape. Doesn't really have any friends. She doesn't really fit in with the other women who work there. And yeah, she's just feeling very much like at a crossroads in her life. And it's not until one day the new psychiatrist starts working there, who's a young woman who seems to have it all together and makes such a strong impression with Eillen that Eillen kind of sort of develops like a fascination with her. She really kind of wants to, I was going to say wear her skin. It's not that deep. But she is just very impressed by her and wants to be more like her. And that just leads her down a really messed up path. Whereas with Lapvona, this is set in a medieval time and it follows a young boy who was born with a birth defect that caused his mother to pass away during childbirth, and as a result his father absolutely hates him. There's a lot of like leftover trauma because of that. And also the villagers aren't too keen on him either. They feel that they can be outwardly cruel to him based on his disfigurement. And the only person that he feels who's on his side is the local midwife. She's just a bizarre character, probably like one of my favourites within this. She will still occasionally breastfeed him despite the fact that he is almost a young man at this point. He derives a lot of comfort from her, and she also isn't the biggest fan of him. She puts up with him because he's one of the only people who's not afraid of her in the village, but she like isn't the nicest herself. Every time I wasn't reading it, I was thinking about what was going to happen next. I was like addicted to it when I was reading it, and I was really sad when it came to finishing it because I was like, oh my god, like if I could have it my way, I would be in the middle of a really great book all the time. I feel like the time between finishing a book and starting a new one is like the most dangerous for me because I can go days at a time without picking up a book. I feel like I had a little bit of a grieving process once I finished this because I just so thoroughly enjoyed it for what it was. So yeah, two completely different books, but Otessa Moshfegh has just become a new favourite author for me. Every time I pick up a book, it's so vastly different from the last, and it still manages to have such a influence on me. I just love her writing style. It's just incredible. Next, we're getting into my top 3 books of 2024 because I've only got 3 left to talk about. So the next one is The Country Will Bring Us No Peace by Matthieu Simard. This has been kind of marketed as a horror novella, but it really isn't. Like, there are elements of horror there, but it's more so the horror of the human experience. And it follows a couple who are determined to have a baby, and they think that maybe if they move to the countryside to an idyllic village, they will have more success and it will be the perfect place to properly start a family. And they make this move, and it seemed to me like it was a very knee-jerk reaction. I had the feeling that we weren't getting the whole story. Everything has gone downhill in this village since the factory closed. What factory that is, we don't know yet, but it's just a mysterious factory. A strange radio tower has been erected, and there are waves coming off of that you can't really explain. And then we also have the fact that many people in the village have started to go missing. The old mechanic who's telling them that they've made the biggest mistake of their life, thinking that they could start a family here. Like, this isn't the place you come to start a family. And the story is just kind of shrouded in mystery. And it's very slow. You have to go at it little by little. And the further I got into the story, the more my initial feelings on it started to make sense within myself. And this isn't a book that you go into and expect to fly through it, despite the fact that it's a novella. It's a book that you do have to sit with and you do have to take your time with in order to, again, appreciate the little things, but to really sit with the emotions that it's bringing across to you. Because this is another very grief-based story. These are the kind of stories I really like to gravitate to, and these are the stories that always kind of stay with me. Because I think grief as an emotion is so interesting and so complex, and the fact that there's no time limit to it. It's one of those emotions that seems to be endless. Like, no matter how far away you get from the passing of a loved one, it's always still there, it's always haunting you, it's always something that will crop up in the back of your mind when you least expect it. And with that, and how this novella explores that feeling, it was done so in such a powerful and unique way. And I think that's why this has made such a big impression on me. I really wasn't expecting to come away with the emotional weight that this novella put on me, and I still haven't really gotten over it. And again, I can't recommend this enough. The second best book of 2024 had to be The Center by Ayesha, Manazir, Siddiqi. This was almost a flawless novel. I gave this a 4.5. This follows a young woman who dreams of being a translator of great works, and she feels like she's really let down by the fact that she is struggling to learn another language in order to be able to achieve this. She loves her job, she loves her work, but she's also in a relationship with a man who seems to be able to pick up languages like as simple as breathing air. He has an uncanny ability to learn a new language and learn it really quickly, and this is something that his girlfriend really, really resents within him, because why should he be the one who has this talent when he doesn't really have the ability to then make good of it? This causes a lot of friction within their relationship, and he decides to let her in on something, on his trick to learning languages. And it all revolves around a mysterious center where you go to for about 2 weeks. And while you're there, you're completely cut off from the life that you know. Your phone is taken away from you, your clothes are taken away from you, you're forced to eat a very specific diet. You have to basically be in isolation while you're doing your studies, and you're listening to tapes of someone talk in the language that you want to learn. And they're just talking about very mundane things. They're talking about their life. Once our main character learns of this place, which is incredibly secretive, you can't even look anything up about it online. He's only able to tell one person about it, because by telling one person, that's basically you referring them to this center. And she decides to take him up on his offer and go to this place. There's definitely more than meets the eye that goes into the happenings of this center. But what I loved about this book is, one, the fact that it was the author's love of language and culture that really shone through in the writing. And there are so many moments where it just has this pure love and nostalgia for the art of language and the art of translation that I found so interesting. I feel like it's just one of the most unique, most creative books that I've read in a number of years now. So this book has horror elements, it definitely has thriller elements, and there's definitely a kind of weird dystopian element to it as well. So they're all my kind of favourite subgenres smushed into one. But what I feel like held the book back and held the story back is that I wish there had been more of an emphasis on the prose themselves. I feel like had it been a little bit more flowery, a little bit more romanticized in certain places, that really would have swung it for me. Obviously, I'm recommending all of these books to you, but if you really want something that you're going to be glued to and you want to find out what happens within the story, The Center is definitely one of the better books that I can recommend. And then finally, the best book that I read in 2024 has definitely got to be The Ruins by Scott Smith. So this is a horror novel. This is a horror novel that I had been meaning to read for absolute years. And once I started reading it, it had such a unique voice to it. It's obviously written in third person, but I felt like the author had an old kind of style to his writing. It just had this narration that was really reminiscent of something from the past, something that I've already experienced, but I can't quite still put my finger on what that was. It was a very immersive book from the very beginning. It was a very anxiety-inducing novel for me. It was a book that I felt very in sync with in a very sort of disturbing way. So the story follows two young couples who are friends, who are Americans on holiday in Mexico. And while they're at the resort, they end up befriending a number of other people who are there on holidays as well, including two brothers who are from Germany. And one of the brothers ends up deciding to take off with a group of archaeologists because he really fancies one of the girls and he wants to spend more time with her. He is meant to be back within a certain time frame and ultimately never comes back. So his brother ends up getting really concerned about him, and he decides to ask the American couples whether they would go with him to this ancient ruins that his brother supposedly went to in order to find him. So they all take off, they get a bus, and then they have to hitch a ride, and at a certain point the guy that they're with refuses to drive any deeper into this forest. And as they're approaching this ancient ruins, they have to go through a village, and the people there are again trying to tell them not to go any further, and it becomes a situation that suddenly turns into a survival horror story. The dread and the horror and the anxiety just continues to build and escalate and get so much worse. And I feel like this is the type of novel that is so perfect for me specifically because like I said earlier on, I'm not a huge fan of reading books with happy endings. I don't like when things work out for characters because I feel like that's not necessarily realistic. This story was so devoid of hope. It was so devoid of happiness. It felt like the characters were reacting in a way to their situation and their surroundings that seemed so believable. It was just such a miserable tale, but told in such a thrilling manner that it kept me just turning the pages and turning the page. And, you know, I do that thing where I'd just be like, one more chapter and then I'll go to sleep. I'm glad that I have another horror novel under my belt that's a 5-star read, because I feel like it's really hard to come across a horror novel that is a genuine 5-star read for me. Maybe 3 books that I've read out of all the horror novels that I've read over the years that would be like 5 stars. And now, after reading this, I was able to add to that. So I really recommend it if you're into survival horror, if you're into horrible, claustrophobic, anxiety-inducing situations. This is definitely worth your while. So that does it for my best books of 2024. Let me know your thoughts if you've read any of these, if you agree, if you disagree. Let me know the best books that you read over 2024, because I'm really working out what books I want to read, what books I want to make a priority for this year, and you'd really be helping me out. And plus I'm just nosy, like you know this already. If you want to keep up with me outside of YouTube, you can always follow me on my TikTok and my Instagram, where I make short form bookish content that I don't necessarily share over here. And if you haven't done so already and you like this type of content, feel free to like and subscribe. And as always, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.